Listen, I hear you. I see it too. The tension, the sharp words, the sense that the world around us is louder, more chaotic, and sometimes more confusing than it used to be. Many of the decisions shaping our lives seem far outside of our control, and it's easy to feel the weight of that. I feel it too. But for the next little while, let's set that stress aside together. Let's take a breath, pull up a chair, and remember something Abraham Lincoln once called the better angels of our nature. Today, we're going to take a look at a moment in American history when conflict didn't escalate, it softened. When two men who once stood on opposite sides of a bitter divide discovered that healing sometimes arrives quietly through humility. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dig in.
Mug on the table, rain on the glass, you've been holding your breath, trying to get past the past. Better angels of our nature, sit down, stay a while. We'll name every shadow till it loosens its bite. Better angels of our nature, in the hurt, in the heart, finding room for a softer heart. Right here.
Have you ever had a relationship that slowly unraveled? Not all at once, not with a single dramatic moment, but gradually through misunderstanding, disagreements, and words that landed harder than anybody expected. At first, the tension feels manageable, you assume relationship is going to recover, but then distance grows. A conversation becomes an argument, and an argument becomes silence, and eventually, two people who once shared meaningful experiences find themselves standing on opposite sides of a divide that feels impossible to cross. Most of us have experienced something like this in our lives. A friendship that cooled, a colleague we once trusted but now we avoid, a family relationship that never quite found its way back after a painful disagreement. What makes these situations difficult is not simply the conflict itself. It is the uncertainty that follows, the wondering, the questions that linger long after the moment passed. Did they misunderstand me? Did I misunderstand them? Could this relationship ever be repaired? Today, we're going to explore a story from American history that speaks directly to that human experience. It is a story about conflict, a story about pride, and a story about how anger can harden relationships for years. But more importantly, it's a story about something else, something quieter, but far more powerful. Because sometimes the better angels of our nature appear not when we win an argument, but when we allow time, reflection, and humility to reshape how we see one another. Welcome to Better Angels of Our Nature with Marcie Gourley, a quiet space where we slow down, think deeply, and explore the habits of heart and mind that help us become our better selves. If you're interested in the free supplemental journaling notes for this episode, head over to www.marciegourley.com or scan this QR code here. In the previous episode of this podcast, we talked about the difference between being hurt and living hurt. We explored how pain is an inevitable part of life, but how we carry that pain can shape our relationships, our outlook, and even our culture. Today, we're going to continue that conversation by looking at what happens when we encounter conflict. One of the quiet truths about human relationships is that anger rarely remains static. It does something over time. Sometimes it softens, perspective grows, the emotional intensity fades, and what once felt like an unforgivable injury begins to look different when viewed through the lens of years rather than moments. But sometimes anger moves in the opposite direction. Instead of softening, it hardens. The mind replays the injury. The story becomes fixed, and slowly the relationship becomes defined by the wound rather than by the fuller history that once connected two people. Understanding this difference between anger that softens and anger that hardens can teach us something profound about ourselves and our capacity of understanding humility. And one of the most remarkable examples of this dynamic comes from the lives of two men who helped shape the early history of the United States, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. So before they became political rivals, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were allies. In the late 18th century, both men found themselves swept into one of the most consequential movements in history, the struggle for American independence. They served together during the Revolutionary period, working closely on matters of diplomacy, governance, and political philosophy. Their personalities were different in nearly every way. John Adams was energetic, outspoken, and often fiery in his convictions. He spoke directly and forcefully, and sometimes with little patience. Thomas Jefferson was quieter and more reflective. He preferred careful thought to heated debate and often expressed his ideas through writing rather than confrontation. Yet, despite their differences, the two men developed a genuine respect for one another. Adams admired Jefferson's intellect and eloquence, and Jefferson respected Adams' courage and relentless commitment to the cause of independence. Together, they helped shape one of the most important documents in American history, the Declaration of Independence. At that moment, their partnership reflected a shared vision of liberty and self-government. They believed they were participating in something larger than themselves, a new experiment in freedom that would influence generations to come. Their friendship was rooted in that shared purpose, but history has a way of testing even the strongest alliances. Over time, the political landscape of the young nation grew increasingly complicated. Differences in philosophy began to sharpen, and questions about the direction of the country became more divisive. Political factions formed, and disagreements that were once intellectual gradually became personal. And the election of 1800 proved especially bitter. Supporters of both men launched harsh criticisms. Newspapers printed accusations and insults, and political rhetoric intensified. Jefferson defeated Adams in that election, and the outcome left wounds that ran deeper than either man publicly acknowledged. For Adams, the loss carried a sense of personal rejection. For Jefferson, the campaign exposed divisions that strained their once cooperative relationship, and so the friendship collapsed. For more than a decade, the two men didn't communicate. The silence was not merely a pause, it was a reflection of pride, hurt, and the lingering tension that can arise when strong personalities collide. What makes their story remarkable is that it might have easily ended there, former allies permanently divided by political rivalry. But something unexpected happened. At first, the idea of even a conversation may have seemed unlikely. So much time had passed. So much tension had accumulated. Yet in 1812, John Adams made the first move. He wrote a letter to Jefferson.
John Adams, you and I have been fellow laborers in the cause of our country.
The tone was cautious but respectful, as though testing whether the door to the conversation might still be open. Jefferson responded, and what followed was one of the most remarkable correspondences in American history. These lines came from their correspondence in 1813, and they beautifully captured the moment when the two men stopped defining each other by their political rivalry and began remembering their shared purpose in the American founding.
John Adams, I always loved Jefferson and still love him. Thomas Jefferson, but you and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other.
These two lines beautifully illustrate the emotional heart of their reconciliation. Adams acknowledges enduring respect, and Jefferson recognizes that the unfinished relationship deserves conversation before life ends.
John Adams, old minds are like old horses. You must exercise them if you wish to keep them in working order. Thomas Jefferson, I look back to the times when we were fellow laborers together with great satisfaction.
This exchange reveals something touching. After years of rivalry, their correspondence became curious, philosophical, even playful. Years after their bitter political rivalry had faded, Adams wrote something quietly revealing to Jefferson. "You and I have lived long enough to know that the world is governed more by passions than reason." What makes the reconciliation between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson so remarkable is that most political rivalries, especially those that become public and deeply personal, don't resolve this way. Historically, political divisions tend to harden over time rather than soften. When people become publicly associated with opposing sides, pride and identity often make reconciliation difficult. The disagreement becomes more than an argument about ideas, it becomes tied to a person's sense of self. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as identity protective reasoning. Once our identity becomes connected with a position or a conflict, admitting that we may have misunderstood or misjudged someone can feel threatening. It requires humility, the willingness to place truth and relationship above pride. But Jefferson and Adams lived long enough to gain something that often changes how people view conflict: perspective. Late in life, many people begin to look back over their experiences and see them within a larger story. The arguments that once felt defining begin to shrink in importance compared to the relationships and shared experience that shaped their lives. Jefferson and Adams had stood together during one of the most consequential moments in human history, the founding of a new nation. With time, that shared experience began to outweigh the political battles that once divided them. Their letters revealed two aging statesmen rediscovering curiosity about one another. They debated ideas, reflected on history, and even joked together. What had once been rivalry slowly became something closer to friendship again. In that sense, their reconciliation offers a profound lesson. Time alone does not heal relationships, but time combined with humility often creates the conditions where healing becomes possible. And sometimes, when humility has room to work, the better angels of our nature quietly return. One of the quiet truths about human relationship is that time changes perspective. When we're in the middle of a conflict, our view tends to narrow. We focus on the injury, the disagreement, the words that hurt. But as the years pass, something often happens. The urgency fades, the emotional intensity softens, and we begin to see the situation from a wider vantage point. The distance between two people is often measured not by disagreement, but by the absence of humility. Psychologists sometimes describe this as emotional distance. When we're no longer immersed in the immediate emotions of a conflict, our brains process the experience differently. We gain access to parts of our thinking that were temporarily overshadowed by anger or defensiveness. Jefferson and Adams experienced exactly this shift. Years removed from the election that divided them, they began to view their disagreements within the larger story of their lives. They recognized that whatever differences had separated them, they had once stood side by side during one of the most pivotal moments in history. That shared experience mattered. It was larger than the rivalry that followed. But time does not always soften anger automatically. Sometimes it does the opposite. When a painful event is repeatedly rehearsed in the mind, the story of the injury can become more entrenched rather than less. Instead of gaining perspective, we become more convinced that our interpretation of the conflict is the only possible one. And that is where humility becomes essential. Psychological research offers helpful insight into why anger sometimes softens and sometimes hardens over time. One important concept is rumination. Rumination refers to the tendency to replay painful experiences repeatedly in our minds. We revisit conversations, imagine alternative outcomes, and rehearse the injury again and again. While this may initially feel like problem solving, rumination often has the opposite effect. It keeps the emotional wound active, preventing the brain from fully processing the experience. Another dynamic psychologists observe is hostile attribution bias. When someone has been deeply hurt, the mind can become more alert to potential threats in future relationships. Neutral actions may be interpreted as intentional slights. Ambiguous situations might feel like confirmation that others can't be trusted. In other words, the hurt from one relationship begins shaping expectations in many others. Anger narrows our vision. Humility widens the lens through which we see one another. When we release the need to win an argument, we often rediscover the value of the relationship. There's also the phenomenon of emotional contagion. Human emotions spread through groups. The tone of the people around us influences our emotional state. When anger becomes the dominant emotional posture in a community, or even on social media, it can quietly amplify conflict across many relationships. The better angels of our nature rarely shout. They whisper through patience, reflection, and grace. Psychology offers a hopeful insight. Cognitive reframing. Cognitive reframing involves reconsidering the story we tell ourselves about a painful experience. Instead of viewing the event through a single interpretation, we allow new perspectives to emerge. This is closely related to the concept of post-traumatic growth, which suggests that people sometimes emerge from painful experiences with deeper empathy, clearer purpose, and greater emotional resilience. Some relationships heal not because the past changed, but because perspective did. And even more importantly, grace is offered, which is our single most God-honoring, character-building offering. Not every wound disappears with time, but many soften when humility makes space for understanding. Here are some powerful truths to hang on to. Time has a quiet way of softening what pride once hardened if we allow humility to do its work. Not every disagreement must end in distance. Sometimes the first step towards healing is simply the willingness to listen again. The story we tell ourselves about a conflict often shapes the future of the relationship more than the conflict itself. When we pause long enough to see another person's humanity, the sharp edges of anger often begin to soften. Humility does not erase the past, but it can open a path forward where resentment once stood. If anger narrows the heart, humility widens it, making room for understanding where certainty once lived. Consider today whether there is a relationship in your life that might benefit from a little more curiosity and a little less certainty. Sometimes the most courageous act is not proving that we are right, but allowing the relationship to matter more than the argument. The better angels of our nature often appear quietly in the moment we choose patience, perspective, and grace. And perhaps the most hopeful truth of all is this: the story of a relationship is rarely finished until humility has had its say. The story of Jefferson and Adams concludes with almost a poetic moment. On July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, both men died within hours of one another. John Adams, unaware that Jefferson had already passed away earlier that day, spoke what are believed to be his final words. Thomas Jefferson still survives. It was a remarkable closing chapter for two men whose relationship had once seemed permanently fractured. In the end, they were not remembered primarily as rivals. They were remembered as fellow architects of a nation. Healing often begins the moment we become curious about another person's story again. The story of a relationship is rarely finished until compassion and humility have both been given a voice. So the story of Jefferson and Adams reminds us that anger does not always have to define the final chapter of a relationship. Time can soften wounds, perspective can widen understanding, and humility, quiet, patient humility, can reopen doors that once seemed permanently closed. Not every conflict in life will resolve the way theirs did. Some relationships will remain distant despite our best efforts. But even in those cases, we still have a choice about what kind of posture we carry within our own hearts. We can allow resentment to narrow our view of others, or we can allow humility to soften the story we tell ourselves about the past conflicts. Because the better angels of our nature often appear not in moments of triumph, but in moments when we choose understanding over pride. And sometimes when we do, we discover that the distance between us and another person is not as permanent as we once believed. If we internalize these truths, if we make them the lens through which we see conflict of any kind in any conversation, we have the power to change the trajectory of every interaction in our lives. Until next time, let's hold steady and call our better angels forward. Thank you for watching. If you like this content, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. My book, 250 Great Things About America from Whitaker House Publishing, where incredible American stories like that of Adams and Jefferson's healing, debuts April 21st, 2026, and pre-orders are available now on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and wherever you find great books.